What should we have the difference between a minor and major penalty be? Let the refs figure it out. What could possibly go wrong? Welcome back for some more NHL 101, and yes, today we're finishing off the small series on penalties with major penalties, and in some cases the game misconducts that can come with them. But before we jump right in, this is the third video in this short series about penalties, so if you are new to hockey and haven't seen those, they do cover a little bit more about the basics and what minor penalties are that do make up the majority of penalties called in the NHL, so I would recommend checking those out before watching the rest of this one. Or maybe watching it afterwards. As a quick refresher though, a major penalty is one that will earn a player a 5-minute stint in the penalty box, and unlike a minor penalty or double minor, this does not come to an end when the opposing team scores a goal, so they will be spending that full 5 minutes in the penalty box regardless of how many goals the other team potentially scores while they're in there. And many major penalties either can or do by default come with a game misconduct attached to them, which then has the offending player ejected from the game and another player on that team of the team's choice going to the penalty box to serve the 5-minute penalty. And on top of that, if it isn't the first game misconduct that that player has earned during the course of that same season, then it also comes with an automatic suspension on top of whatever other discipline the league decides to hand down. And finally, before we start talking about some specific penalties, again with major penalties like we talked about in the minor penalties video, many times when one of these is called, it's just a more severe version of a minor penalty. Again, that's up to the referee's discretion to determine whether or not a major is worth being called rather than, say, a double minor or just a minor, and if they do decide to go with a major, it does have to go to video review to confirm that a major is worth being called in that situation. Usually this only happens if some sort of significant injury resulted in whatever the minor penalty was. As an example from another sport, I suppose you could kind of say, if you're a longtime football fan, this is kind of like how a while back there used to be different versions of the face mask penalty, a 5, 10, and 15-yard version, depending on how badly the face mask was pulled, but it's maybe a bit of a stretch. But there still are some penalties that are a major penalty no matter what, though many of them have some relation to the first one we're going to talk about, which is also easily the most common major called, that being fighting. Now, of course, to some extent, fighting has always been a part of hockey and the NHL, and while we're not going to get too deep into the history of fighting, that's probably a whole nother video for another time, it is safe to say that it has changed quite a bit over the last decade or two, and probably will continue to change as things go on. And while there are probably more opinions on fighting and what should and shouldn't be allowed in fighting in hockey than any other rule in the entire sport, like it or not, it has been moving to a more controlled version of where the league used to be. For a long time, there were hardly any rules at all around fighting, something that eventually a handful of teams were all too happy to take advantage of, to a point where it almost became that you were going to see boxing on ice, and occasionally during the intermissions they would play a little bit of hockey. Now, it's definitely more the opposite, where you won't even necessarily see a fight every game you go to. And in a conscious effort on the part of the league to reintroduce a little bit more speed and skill into the game over size and toughness with players that are better at handling the puck than their fists, they have also, I guess in the name of player safety, moved to adding more and more rules around what is and isn't allowed in fighting and limiting the amount of fights that happen in games. As a result, this is one of the more complicated rules with more to it than just about any other penalty in the entire game. In fact, there's about 5 pages dedicated to it in the NHL's rulebook, and we're not going to have time to get into every single little detail to do with fighting, but we'll get the broad strokes at the very least. And by those rules, a fight is distinguished when one or more players throw multiple punches at each other or start wrestling in a way that makes it hard for referees to get involved and separate the players. Of course, here it is worth mentioning that when it comes to hockey fights, It's usually pretty clear when one's about to happen or has just started, as the two players involved will drop their gloves, sometimes circle a couple of times before grabbing each other's jersey with one hand, and wildly throwing punches with the other, occasionally even hitting each other. And then the fight will come to an end, either when the referees decide that there's been enough and will go and break it up, or more often when one player is either taken to the ice or trips and falls. At which point the refs will step in to break up the fight. Usually both guys then get off the ice, looking like they think that they've won and trying to look as tough as possible, while everybody else taps their sticks because that's just what you do. When it comes to the penalties handed out for fighting, both players that engage in a fight end up getting a 5-minute major, as well as often getting a 10-minute misconduct. And while that might sound like a pretty significant punishment as far as the game is concerned, it rarely has a particularly big impact, as, again, both players are pretty likely to have been on separate teams. So both teams end up having one player with a 5-minute penalty or a 10-minute misconduct, and play ends up being even, whether that's 4-4 or 5-on-5. Of course, it is certainly worth mentioning here that at the start of the second paragraph of this 5-page rule, it does point out that referees are granted a, quote, very wide latitude when it comes to what or how severe the types of penalties they want to hand out are going to be for fighting. But with that said, there still are some ground rules when it comes to fighting, at least right now anyway, in the NHL. Starting with that when a fight starts, every player who isn't one of the two in the fight has to clear the area and go to the area around the bench, unless of course that's where the fight is happening, in which case they just have to give a healthy berth around the fight so as to not get involved. In the case where players fail to do so, let's say a third player tries to join the fight, someone leaves the bench during a fight, or two other players try to start fighting after the start of the original one, all of that can lead to a game misconduct being handed out to those players. With the purpose of all this being that once that first fight starts happening, the referees can kind of just focus on that and make sure that everything goes the way it should with that fight, rather than having an all-out bench-clearing type of brawl like we used to see a couple of decades ago. As for the players actually fighting, neither one is allowed to move their helmets or jerseys prior to the fight, and of course it's pretty much a straight-up fist fight. There's no using sticks or even having your hands taped up prior to the fight. So if a player does have tape on their hands or fingers under their gloves for one reason or another, then they probably shouldn't be going and getting into fights because they are going to get more heavily penalized. But going back to the helmets and jerseys part, once the fight has gotten started, if a player's helmet comes off, which they frequently do during the course of a fight, that's perfectly fine. They just can't be intentionally removed. As far as jerseys are concerned, those do have to stay attached during the course of a fight, and this is something that jerseys even come partially equipped for, with a fight strap in the back that players have to hook onto their gear so that their jerseys don't come off in the case of a fight. And if a player doesn't have their jersey properly hooked up with that fight strap, gets into a fight, and the jersey comes off, then they can get even more severe penalties like a game misconduct or worse, again at the discretion of the referees. Other than that, as we mentioned earlier, the fight pretty much just goes on until the referees decide to try to step in to stop it, or more often one or both players end up falling to the ice, at which point the referees will step in. If, however, one or both players continue to try to fight after the referees have told them to stop, then game misconducts will be handed out. This usually happens when one player refuses to stop throwing punches after the referees have stepped in, or after the two players go to the ice, which is the accepted end of the fight. There are also rules around when and where players can fight. For one, players can only fight on the ice or playing surface, so there's no fighting allowed in the tunnels, benches, or really anywhere off the ice. Fights are also restricted to happening during the 3 periods of the game, so no fighting before or after the game, or between periods. This is also why it's not terribly infrequent to see fights break out immediately after puck drop, either at the start of the game, if something were to have happened between two teams in a previous game, or maybe at the start of a period if something happened at the end of the previous one. With that having been said though, one thing probably worth mentioning here that can get kind of weird to get used to if you are newer to hockey is that as long as it's during the period, a fight still is allowed to break out with play stopped. So let's say there was an offsides or maybe a scrum in front of the net or something like that, and the referees blew their whistle. A fight is perfectly okay to break out at that point, as long as it's not at the start of or the end of the period. The one exception to all of that being that if a player starts or instigates a fight in the final 5 minutes of a game or anytime in overtime, then that will lead to a game misconduct. Of course, this is because, again, fighting is a 5-minute major penalty, so starting a fight after the final 5 minutes of a game where you're just trying to get away with less of a penalty is something that they're going to crack down on. And that leads us to a couple of different roles within the fighting penalty that a player can play that can earn them extra penalty time on top of just fighting, one of which being the instigator penalty. Now, this is one that can earn a player both a minor, major, and even game misconduct all at the same time, and can be handed out for all sorts of things at the discretion of the referees. Anywhere from being the first player to drop their gloves, first player to throw a punch, or just having a menacing attitude or demeanor. Basically, anything the referees see as being the person who was clearly the one picking the fight. Now, this is not necessarily handed out in every fight, and in fact, most fights in the NHL, I think it's safe to say, tend to be ones where both players are equally willing, at least once the fight gets started, and no instigator is clear and no instigator penalty is therefore handed out. In fact, again, especially for those of you who are newer to hockey, because this might seem kind of weird otherwise, it's not particularly uncommon for two players on, of course, opposing teams to kind of pre-arrange a fight, with one saying, hey, you want to go, and the other one agreeing to fight, and then they go at it after the puck is dropped. That does seem probably kind of weird if you're used to other sports, but that's how things happen in hockey. Really, where the instigator role comes in is especially in cases where fights don't happen in the way that they're supposed to, like, for example, as we talked about, a fight that happens in the last 5 minutes of a game, or maybe somewhere off of the ice. In those cases, the person who was the instigator of the fight is usually determined and more heavily penalized. In fact, the other participant can even just get off as being kind of just thrown into the situation. The other of these fighting role type of penalties is the aggressor penalty, which is the one that's handed to a player for refusing to stop fighting or punching at the other player after the fight is over, with the two players going to the ice, or when the referees step in and intervene in the fight, thereby stopping it. It can also, however, be handed to a player who is throwing multiple punches at another player that refuses to engage in an actual fight. And with the aggressor penalty, as is the case with most of these rules around a proper fight in the NHL, if you break any of these rules, they usually lead to a game misconduct, which, again, if you get more than one of those, then you do end up with a suspension. But of course, as I mentioned at the beginning of all of this, fighting is very much a part of the NHL, at least for now, and I don't really see that changing anytime soon. And for the most part, while fights do happen fairly often and the fighting penalty is still handed out, the rules do tend to be followed, as most players are pretty respectful when it comes to fighting, which seems a little weird to say, but again, it's a part of the game that most players understand how it works and will follow those rules, so a lot of these game misconduct and things along the side are more just to make sure that things do go the way that they're supposed to. Which, again, usually you would think that fighting in sports is things not going the way that they're supposed to, but hockey's a bit different. Outside of fighting, there really aren't any other common major penalties, or at least not major penalties that aren't just a more severe version of a minor penalty that we already talked about in the minor penalties video. The one worth mentioning here, though, is boarding. And while boarding is a more severe version of a minor penalty when it is a major, it does have a tendency, as we mentioned in the minor penalties video, to turn into a major more often than most other minor penalties because of the violent and dangerous nature of this particular infraction. I mean, it is literally written into the definition of the boarding penalty, which is a hit on a defenseless player into the boards in a violent or dangerous way. Of course, with the boards again being the hard plastic or plexiglass walls of the ice surface. Now, again, there is a whole lot of referee discretion here, especially when it comes to whether or not it should be a minor or major penalty. But especially when that distinction is whether or not the penalty led to an injury. With boarding, this is one that can frequently turn into an injury and therefore does frequently turn into a major penalty. And especially with the NHL continuing to try to do better when it comes to player safety, at least especially when it comes to head injuries, and with boarding being one of the leading causes of head injuries, this is definitely one that referees are watching pretty carefully and can definitely turn into a more severe penalty than a lot of other minors. Of course, though, as we've said now a few times with different penalties over the course of the series, as is kind of the nature of a free-flowing game, there is a whole lot of referee discretion when it comes to this penalty, and especially the whole defenseless player part of the penalty, which even includes the fact that if a player makes themselves defenseless immediately before or as the hit is happening, then that doesn't have to be a boarding call, which does leave maybe a little bit too much wiggle room and interpretation on the part of a referee who is trying to enforce the rules in a fast-moving game. Either way, though, when it comes to specifically major penalties, boarding is still one of the more common causes of a major penalty, and so I thought it would be worth mentioning here. There are still other major penalties, though, that, while not as common, are major penalties regardless of severity, which include checking from behind, which is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. It's just checking or hitting a player from behind when they don't see the hit coming, as well as spearing, which is using the blade end of the stick as a weapon in pretty much any way, but especially a stabbing motion, as well as butt ending, which is using the other end of the stick as a weapon, as well as biting, kicking, and pushing off a player with your skate. And with all of these last few penalties that I've mentioned, they are not only a major penalty, but also an automatic game misconduct, which again means the player is ejected from the game. So in the end, when it comes to major penalties, pretty much everything here has to do with either fighting or a more severe version of a minor penalty. And of course, with the large amount of referee discretion that comes into calling a major penalty rather than a minor, and especially with how influential in a game a guaranteed 5-minute power play can be, major penalties do tend to draw quite a bit of controversy when they are called. Especially in, let's just say, a Game 7 of a playoff series. Either way, though, that does pretty much bring us to the end of this one. There are still, technically speaking, a few other major penalties that really just are never called, so I didn't bother mentioning them. But if you find those and have questions, do feel free to leave those down in the comment section. Otherwise, if you made it to this point, thank you very much for watching. If you did like or enjoy this video, there are buttons for that kind of stuff down below that I would appreciate you using. Otherwise, if you have any other questions about anything that I talked about here, do feel free to leave those in the comment section as well. And until next time, stay safe out there and be good to each other. Peace.